Kaleth stood at the observation window of the transport ship and watched the blue planet grow larger in the viewport as they approached the human homeworld called Earth. And he felt something he had not experienced in his 300 years of life, which was uncertainty about what he would find among these strange newcomers to the galaxy. And the Valorian Empire had sent him here with a specific mission to observe and understand humanity's military capabilities, because something about these humans disturbed the ancient powers that ruled the known galaxy, and they needed answers before it was too late. The humans had only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago, which made them infants compared to civilizations like the Valorians, who had been exploring the stars for over 10,000 years. And yet in those 50 short years, humanity had been involved in more military conflicts than most species experienced in a millennium. And what troubled the Valorian High Council was not that humans fought, but how they fought and the results they achieved against forces that should have easily defeated them. Kaleth had studied warfare across thousands of worlds and documented the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and he considered himself an expert on military strategy and combat psychology. But the reports coming back about human conflicts made no sense according to established military doctrine, and commanders who faced humans in battle reported tactics that ranged from brilliant to completely insane, and often both at the same time in enemy forces that outnumbered and outgunned. Human units somehow found themselves retreating or destroyed. The transport docked at a massive orbital station above Mars, which was humanity's primary military hub in their home system, and Kaleth gathered his equipment and prepared to meet his hosts, and he had been assigned to observe operations aboard a human warship for an extended period, and the High Council wanted first-hand accounts of how humans actually functioned in combat situations. A human officer met him at the airlock and introduced himself as Commander Jake Sullivan, and he was shorter than Kaleth by half a meter, with graying hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw, and his uniform was neat, but worn in places, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen many battles and survived them all. Commander Sullivan led Kaleth through the station corridors while explaining the basics of human military organization, and Kaleth noticed immediately how different it felt from Valorian military facilities, and human crew members walked past talking and laughing with each other, and some even made jokes with their superior officers, and it seemed chaotic and undisciplined compared to the strict hierarchies Kaleth was accustomed to. They arrived at a docking bay where a warship waited, and Sullivan gestured toward it with obvious pride, and told Kaleth this was the Defiant, and she had been in service for 20 years, which was ancient by human standards. But her crew kept her, running and fighting, and Kaleth studied the vessel, noting its worn hull plating and the obvious repair patches covering damage from previous battles. On the bridge of the Defiant, Kaleth met the key crew members, starting with Lieutenant Amy Porter, who served as the tactical officer, and she was young for her position, with dark hair pulled back in a practical style, and when she shook Kaleth's hand, her grip was firm and her eyes showed intelligence and something else that Kaleth would later identify as barely contained aggression. Chief Engineer Greg Mason was the next introduction, and he was older than Sullivan, with grease stains on his uniform and calloused hands from years of working with machinery, and he explained with enthusiasm how he had modified the Defiant's systems to exceed their original specifications, and Kaleth realized this human actually enjoyed the challenge of keeping an outdated ship operational. Over the following days, Kaleth observed the crew going about their duties, and he conducted interviews trying to understand what made humans different from other species. And he spoke with Dr. Lisa Hayes, who ran the medical bay, and she told him stories about human resilience and their ability to survive injuries that would kill most other beings. And she showed him records of crew members who had recovered from wounds that should have been fatal. Sergeant Paul Banks commanded the ship's Marine contingent, and he was a large, muscular human, covered in scars from ground combat. And when Kaleth asked him about fighting, the sergeant grinned and said humans were born for it, and that they had been fighting each other for thousands of years before they ever reached the stars, and all that experience made them very good at killing when they needed to. Kaleth found the casual way humans talked about violence disturbing, because in Valorian culture, warfare was treated as a necessary but somber duty, and yet humans seemed almost enthusiastic about combat, and they told stories of past battles with animation and even humor, and they honored their warriors with celebrations rather than quiet respect. The ship operated on patrol duty in the outer territories, where human space bordered regions claimed by various other species, and tensions were always high in these areas, and Caleth observed how the crew maintained readiness even during quiet periods, and they ran constant drills and training exercises, as if expecting battle at any moment. Commander Sullivan explained that the Defiant was assigned to protect human colonies and merchant vessels in this sector, from pirates and occasional raids by hostile species, and the most common threat came from the Kryn Collective, which was an aggressive reptilian species known throughout the galaxy for their brutal military efficiency and their tendency to attack targets they perceived as weak. During the first week, Caleth noticed something strange about how the crew interacted with each other, and they formed close bonds that went beyond professional relationships, and they ate meals together and shared personal stories and celebrated birthdays and other events, and Lieutenant Porter explained that human military units became like families because they depended on each other for survival, and that trust was more important than rank. The crew also showed concern for civilians in a way that Caleth found unusual, because most military forces prioritized strategic objectives over individual lives, but humans seemed to take protection of civilians personally, and Sullivan told him that every human warship's primary mission was to defend those who could not defend themselves, and that this principle guided all their tactical decisions. Caleth began compiling notes for his report, trying to capture these observations in ways his superiors would understand, but he struggled to explain the contradictions he witnessed, and humans were disciplined yet informal, and they joked about serious matters yet took their duties with absolute commitment, and they seemed to care deeply about individuals while also preparing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. On the 8th day of his assignment, the Defiant received an emergency transmission, and Caleth was on the bridge when it came through, and a civilian transport was under attack by Kryn raiders near the border zone, and the message was desperate, reporting that 3 Kryn warships were firing on a vessel carrying 500 civilians, including families with children. Commander Sullivan's entire demeanor changed in an instant, and his casual friendliness vanished, replaced by cold focus, and he began issuing orders rapidly, and Lieutenant Porter brought up tactical displays showing the distance to the attack and the enemy force composition, and Chief Mason started pushing the engines beyond their normal limits, and the entire crew moved with sudden purpose. Caleth checked the tactical data and felt his concern growing because 3 Kryn warships represented a significant threat, and the logical response would be to call for reinforcements before engaging. But Sullivan was already plotting an intercept course and ordering the crew to battle stations, and the Defiant turned toward the combat zone and accelerated to maximum speed. The observer realized with a mixture of fascination and dread that he was about to witness human warfare firsthand, and everything he had studied and all his years of experience were about to be tested against the reality of how humans actually fought. And as the Defiant raced toward battle, Caleth understood that his comfortable theories about military doctrine were about to collide with something far more primal and dangerous than he had ever imagined. The Defiant dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the combat zone, and Caleth immediately saw the situation on the tactical displays, and 3 Kryn warships had surrounded a human civilian transport that was venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches, and the transport's weak shields were failing under the sustained assault, and escape pods were launching, but the Kryn were destroying them as they ejected, and Caleth felt sick watching the calculated murder of defenseless civilians. Commander Sullivan studied the display for perhaps 3 seconds before making his decision, and he ordered Lieutenant Porter to plot an attack vector that would take them straight into the center of the enemy formation, and Caleth could not believe what he was hearing because standard military doctrine against superior numbers demanded either withdrawal or a defensive position while calling for support, but Sullivan was ordering a direct assault. Porter acknowledged the order without hesitation, and her fingers flew across her console, plotting a course that made Caleth's tactical training scream warnings, and the Defiant would be exposed to fire from all 3 enemy ships simultaneously, and the crew moved to execute the maneuver with no debate or discussion, and Caleth realized these humans were either supremely confident or completely insane. The ship accelerated toward the Kryn formation at full thrust, and Sullivan ordered specific sections of the ship to vent atmosphere, creating a cloud of frozen vapor and debris that would confuse enemy targeting sensors. And Caleth watched Chief Mason comply immediately, even though the procedure meant deliberately damaging their own vessel, and the engineer seemed almost pleased to be doing something so unconventional. The Kryn ships detected the Defiant's approach and began turning to engage the new threat, and their weapons were powerful enough to tear through the human destroyer's shields in sustained fire, and they began launching missiles and energy beams toward the approaching vessel, and Porter began evasive maneuvers that pushed the ship's structural integrity to its limits. The Defiant wove through the incoming fire with movements that seemed impossible for a vessel of its size, and Caleth felt the deck shift beneath his feet as inertial dampeners struggled to compensate, and several shots grazed the hull, causing damage alerts to sound, but Porter kept the ship moving, and somehow they survived the initial barrage and closed the distance to the enemy formation. What happened next would stay with Caleth for the rest of his life, because as the Defiant entered weapons range, Sullivan did not order measured return fire or attempt to disable a single enemy vessel, and instead, he ordered every weapon on the ship to fire at once, and the human destroyer unleashed its full arsenal in a devastating broadside that caught the nearest Kryn ship completely off guard. The enemy vessel's shields collapsed under the concentrated assault, and hull breaches erupted across its surface, and the Kryn ship began tumbling out of formation, trailing atmosphere and debris, and Caleth saw that Sullivan had sacrificed tactical positioning for pure aggressive firepower, and it had worked, but now the Defiant was surrounded by two very angry enemy warships. The bridge crew showed no fear at their situation, and instead Caleth heard Lieutenant Porter actually laugh as she executed another impossible maneuver that took them under one of the Kryn ships, and Sullivan ordered them to position the Defiant between the transport and the remaining attackers, and Chief Mason diverted power from non-essential systems to strengthen the shields facing the enemy. The two Kryn vessels began a coordinated assault, trying to overwhelm the human destroyer through superior firepower, and the Defiant's shields started failing section by section, and damage reports came in from multiple decks, and Caleth watched human crew members respond to each crisis with efficiency, born from extensive training, and nobody panicked and nobody suggested retreat. Sullivan moved around the bridge, coordinating his crew's efforts and encouraging them, and he called out successful hits with enthusiasm and made jokes about near misses, and his attitude seemed to energize everyone around him, and Caleth observed that human command style focused on morale and emotional connection, rather than cold calculation, and somehow it made the crew fight harder. A Kryn missile got through their defenses and impacted the engineering section, and the explosion tore through multiple decks, and Chief Mason reported casualties and significant damage to the power systems, and several crew members were trapped in a compartment that was losing atmosphere rapidly, and standard procedure would be to seal that section and preserve the rest of the ship. But Sergeant Banks did not wait for orders, and he grabbed his Marines and headed toward the damaged section immediately, and Sullivan saw what was happening and simply nodded his approval, and Caleth wanted to protest because it was tactically foolish to risk more lives trying to save people who were likely already dead. But nobody else on the bridge seemed concerned. Banks and his team fought their way through fire and smoke into the damaged area, and they used emergency equipment to patch hull breaches, while dragging out wounded crew members, and two of the Marines died when a secondary explosion collapsed a bulkhead, but they kept going, and they pulled out 5 survivors, including young Ensign Chris Wade, who was unconscious but alive. The rescue operation took precious minutes, during which the Defiant continued taking damage, and the ship's combat effectiveness was reduced by 30%, according to Caleth's calculations, and yet when Banks reported that all survivors were recovered, the bridge crew actually cheered, and Sullivan personally thanked the sergeant over the communication system, and Caleth understood that humans valued individual lives in ways that seemed to defy military logic. Lieutenant Porter had been using the time to study the enemy movement patterns, and she proposed a maneuver to Sullivan that involved using the damaged transport as cover while simultaneously firing at both remaining Kryn ships and the commander. Approved it immediately, and the Defiant moved into position behind the drifting civilian vessel. The maneuver worked because the Kryn were reluctant to fire on the transport, since it was their original target, and they wanted it intact for some reason, and this gave Porter the opportunity she needed, and she coordinated the Defiant's weapons to hit both enemy ships in rapid succession, and the focused fire damaged their engines and slowed their ability to maneuver. Dr. Hayes reported from medical that they had 20 wounded crew members and 3 dead, and she was performing surgery on 2 critical cases while her staff worked to stabilize others, and she asked Sullivan if they could disengage long enough for her to properly treat the casualties, and the commander told her to do what she could, because they were not leaving until the transport was safe. The battle continued for another 18 minutes by Caleth's count, and it was the most chaotic and brutal combat he had ever witnessed, and the Defiant was operating with failing shields and damaged weapons systems and reduced power, but the crew never stopped fighting, and they adapted to each new problem and found ways to keep their ship in the battle. Just when Caleth calculated that the Defiant would be destroyed within the next few minutes, 3 more human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and joined the fight, and the reinforcements immediately attacked the Kryn vessels with the same aggressive tactics that Sullivan had employed, and faced with fresh enemies and mounting damage, the Kryn ships made the decision to retreat. The enemy vessels turned and jumped to faster-than-light speed, leaving the damaged transport and the battered Defiant behind. And as soon as they were gone, the human ships immediately began rescue operations, and Sullivan ordered his crew to assist the transport and check for survivors in the destroyed escape pods. The bridge crew started cheering and congratulating each other, and Porter stood up and hugged the crew member next to her, and Chief Mason reported from engineering that the ship was in terrible condition but still functional, and Sullivan allowed himself a small smile and thanked everyone for their performance. Caleth sat in his observer station trying to process what he had witnessed, because by all logical analysis the Defiant should have withdrawn or been destroyed, and the transport should have been lost with all hands. And yet somehow, through tactics that violated every principle of conventional warfare, the humans had won and saved almost 400 civilians. That evening, Caleth attended a memorial service for the crew members who had died, and he watched Commander Sullivan speak about each person personally and share stories about their lives and their service, and the crew cried openly, showing emotions that would be considered weakness in most military cultures, and yet Caleth sensed that this shared grief somehow made them stronger. After the service, Lieutenant Porter found Caleth and asked him what he thought of his first experience with human combat, and the observer admitted he did not understand how they had survived, and Porter smiled and told him that humans had one advantage that most species lacked, and when Caleth asked what that was, she said simply that humans refused to accept defeat, even when defeat was the logical outcome, and that made all the difference. The Defiant limped into a forward operating base called Station Victory for repairs, and Caleth used the time to continue his observations and interviews, and he needed to understand what he had witnessed during that battle, because his entire military education insisted that the humans should have lost, and yet they had won through sheer determination and tactics that seemed more like controlled madness than proper warfare. Colonel Rachel Price commanded the station, and she invited Caleth to her office, where she had prepared files and records about human military history, and she seemed to understand what the Valorian observer was struggling with, and she told him that most alien species made the same mistake when evaluating humanity, and they tried to apply logical frameworks to a species that operated on different principles. Price showed Caleth records of human conflicts throughout their history, starting with ancient battles where warriors fought with primitive weapons and progressing through ages of increasingly deadly warfare. And Caleth saw wars that killed millions, and conflicts that consumed entire continents, and the sheer scale of human violence against themselves was staggering. And Price explained that every human alive was descended from survivors of thousands of years of constant warfare. The colonel pulled up footage from something humans called the Second World War, and Caleth watched cities burn and armies clash in battles involving millions of soldiers, and Price pointed out that this conflict had occurred less than 200 years ago by human reckoning, and the species had been unified for only 70 years, and before that they had been actively trying to exterminate each other with weapons of terrible power. Caleth asked why humanity had been so violent toward itself, and Price considered the question carefully before explaining that humans evolved as persistence hunters on a world with dangerous predators, and they developed complex social structures and tribal identities, and the same traits that made them cooperative within groups made them competitive between groups, and warfare became woven into the fabric of human civilization. She showed him examples of human military innovations across their history, and Caleth saw that humans had developed thousands of different fighting styles and weapon systems and tactical doctrines, and Price explained that this diversity came from different human cultures all solving the same problems in unique ways, and when humanity unified, they brought all this knowledge together into a military tradition that had depth most species could not match. The colonel arranged for Caleth to observe training exercises, and he watched human Marines practice close-quarters combat with an intensity that seemed excessive for modern warfare dominated by energy weapons and spacecraft, and when he asked about this, a corporal named Nina Foster explained that humans trained for every possible scenario, because human history had taught them that unlikely situations happened with disturbing regularity. Foster showed Kaleth her combat gear, and explained each piece of equipment, and she carried a knife even though modern body armor made such weapons nearly useless. And when Kaleth questioned this, she smiled, and said her grandfather had carried a knife in combat and his grandfather before him, and it was tradition. And humans valued traditions because they connected them to all the warriors who had come before. Kaleth attended briefings where human officers discussed strategies, and he noticed they referenced historical battles constantly, and they studied conflicts from hundreds or thousands of years ago, looking for lessons that might apply to modern warfare. And Lieutenant Porter told him that human military academies required officers to learn history extensively, because the best way to predict how humans would fight was to understand how they had always fought. During his time at the station, Kaleth also observed human culture during peacetime, and he shared meals with crew members and listened to their music and learned about their families back on Earth and the colonies. And he began to understand that the same intensity humans brought to warfare, they also brought to everything else in their lives, and they loved fiercely and grieved deeply and celebrated with abandon. One evening, Porter invited Kaleth to watch recordings of famous human battles, and she showed him footage from places with names like Thermopylae and Normandy and Stalingrad, and Kaleth watched humans fight against impossible odds and hold positions that could not be held. And the observer asked why these battles were remembered, and Porter explained that humans honored those who fought the hardest, not those who won most easily. She told him about Thermopylae, where 300 Spartan warriors had held a narrow pass against an army of hundreds of thousands for 3 days, knowing they would die, but buying time for their people to prepare defenses, and that battle had occurred over 3,000 years ago, but every human military officer still studied it and drew inspiration from it. Kaleth began to see patterns in human warfare, and they did not fight like other species who sought to minimize casualties and achieve objectives efficiently. And instead, humans often seemed to deliberately choose the most difficult approach, and they valued courage and sacrifice above tactical superiority. And they would rather die fighting than surrender, even when surrender was the logical choice. The peaceful period ended when intelligence reports started coming in about Kryn military movements, and scouts reported that the collective was assembling a massive fleet far larger than any force they had ever gathered. An analysis indicated the target was a human colony world called Sanctuary, which housed 3 million civilians and served as a major agricultural center. Command staff met to discuss the situation, and Kaleth attended as an observer, and the numbers were devastating, and the Kryn were bringing over 200 warships, including several dreadnought-class vessels that each matched multiple human ships in firepower, and humanity could muster perhaps 80 ships to defend Sanctuary, and many of those were older vessels like the Defiant. Kaleth expected the humans to order evacuation of the colony and establish defensive positions at more strategic locations, and when he suggested this, the room went silent, and Colonel Price looked at him with an expression he could not read, and she asked if the Valorian Empire would abandon 3 million of its citizens, and Kaleth admitted they would if tactical analysis indicated the position could not be held. Admiral Helen Price, who was Rachel's sister and commanded the defense fleet, stood up and addressed the room, and she said that humanity had a simple policy regarding their colonies, and they did not abandon their people, and if the Kryn wanted Sanctuary, they would have to pay for every meter of space in blood. And the assembled officers responded with grim determination, and nobody suggested withdrawal. Kaleth ran calculations, and his analysis showed that the human fleet had less than a 15% probability of victory, even with optimal tactics. And he pointed this out, and Admiral Price nodded and said she understood the odds, but the decision was already made, and they would make their stand at Sanctuary, because that was what humans did, and they protected their own regardless of cost. The Defiant received orders to join the defense fleet, and the ship was barely repaired, with temporary patches covering major damage, and Chief Mason reported that they could fight, but the vessel would not survive sustained combat. And Commander Sullivan accepted this information calmly and told his crew they were going to defend Sanctuary, and not one person requested reassignment or transfer. Kaleth spoke privately with Sullivan and asked why the commander would take his damaged ship into a battle they could not win. And Sullivan was quiet for a moment before responding. And he said that somewhere on Sanctuary was a farming family with 2 children who were growing up safe and happy, and they probably did not even know a battle was coming. And those people deserved to live their lives in peace, and if Sullivan and his crew had to die to give them that chance, then it was a worthy trade. The observer realized he was witnessing something that his people had lost millennia ago, if they had ever possessed it, and humans valued individual lives and collective survival equally, and this created a paradox where they would sacrifice themselves for strangers and fight hopeless battles because some things mattered more than tactical calculations. The fleet assembled over the following days, and Kaleth watched 80 human warships prepare for combat against an enemy that outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. And the crews were frightened, and he could see it in their faces and hear it in their voices, and yet they boarded their ships and checked their weapons and prepared to fight, and not one of them ran. Lieutenant Porter spent time going over tactical scenarios with Kaleth, and she showed him how the human fleet would attempt to use speed and aggression to offset their numerical disadvantage. And she admitted the chances were poor, but said that sometimes all you could do was make the enemy pay such a high price that they regretted attacking, and maybe that would be enough. The day before the fleet departed for Sanctuary, Kaleth attended another gathering where crew members from various ships met in the station's recreation area, and they drank and sang songs and told stories, and some of them cried while others laughed, and they all knew that many of them would not return, but they celebrated life and friendship anyway. And Kaleth understood this was how humans faced death, and they acknowledged it and feared it, but refused to let it stop them. The Kryn fleet arrived at Sanctuary with overwhelming force, and Kaleth watched the tactical display fill with red icons representing enemy warships, and he counted 217 vessels, including massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed even the largest human ships, and the sheer size of the enemy force made his combat analysis algorithms return failure probabilities above 90%. Admiral Helen Price divided the human fleet into rapid response groups rather than maintaining a traditional defensive line, and the Defiant joined a strike force led by Captain Kate Morrison aboard the cruiser Relentless, and their mission was to harass the Kryn advance and create opportunities for devastating counterattacks. And Kaleth noted this strategy relied on chaos and aggression rather than ordered defense. The Kryn fleet advanced in perfect formation with their ships moving in coordinated patterns that demonstrated their species' preference for order and discipline, and they approached Sanctuary with the confidence of a force that had never been defeated, and they began launching fighter craft and preparing their main weapons for bombardment of the orbital platforms. Then the human fleet attacked, and they came from multiple vectors simultaneously, with small groups of ships striking at the edges of the Kryn formation and breaking away before the enemy could respond effectively, and Admiral Price had abandoned conventional warfare entirely, and instead embraced hit-and-run tactics that prevented the Kryn from using their numerical superiority. The Defiant accelerated toward a cluster of Kryn cruisers, and Commander Sullivan ordered the ship into a debris field created by destroyed orbital satellites, and Porter cut the engines and power signature to minimum, and they drifted silently, while enemy ships passed nearby, and Kaleth watched Kryn vessels move past their hiding spot, completely unaware of the threat. Sullivan waited until 3 enemy cruisers were within optimal firing range, and then he ordered maximum power to weapons, and the Defiant emerged from the debris field and unleashed full broadsides at point-blank distance, and the Kryn ships had no time to raise shields or evade, and the human destroyer's weapons tore through their hulls, causing catastrophic damage, and then the Defiant disappeared back into the debris cloud before reinforcements could arrive. This pattern repeated throughout the first day of battle, and human ships refused to engage in the stand-up fights that the Kryn expected, and instead they ambushed and fled and attacked from unexpected angles and used every piece of wreckage and every orbital structure as cover, and Kaleth recognized this as persistence hunting applied to space warfare, and humans were exhausting their prey through constant harassment. But the Kryn had numbers, and they adapted to human tactics, and they began sweeping areas with coordinated sensor nets, and they accepted casualties in exchange for slowly pushing the human fleet back toward the colony, and by the end of the first day 17 human ships had been destroyed, and the Kryn had lost 40 vessels, but they could afford those losses and humanity could not. On the second day the battle intensified, and Kaleth watched a human carrier called Valiant take critical damage and lose main power, while surrounded by Kryn warships, and the carrier's captain ordered all remaining fighters to launch in a final attack. And then he aimed his powerless ship at the nearest Kryn dreadnought and used emergency thrusters to ram the enemy vessel, and both ships exploded in a blast that lit up the tactical display. The sacrifice created a gap in the Kryn formation, and 3 human destroyers exploited the opening and focused their fire on a Kryn command ship and destroyed it, and the loss of command coordination caused confusion in that section of the enemy. Fleet and Admiral Price immediately sent more ships to exploit the weakness, and for 2 hours the humans pushed back the advance. Lieutenant Porter coordinated the Defiant's movements with incredible skill, and she seemed to anticipate where the enemy would be before they arrived, and she used the ship's inferior speed as an advantage by positioning them in places where faster Kryn vessels could not maneuver effectively, and Sullivan trusted her instincts completely and followed her suggestions without question. Chief Mason performed miracles in engineering, and he kept the damaged ship running through repairs that violated every safety protocol, and he rerouted power systems in configurations that should have caused reactor failures. And when Kaleth questioned one particularly dangerous modification, Mason grinned and said if they were going to die anyway, they might as well die doing something interesting. Dr. Hayes worked constantly in medical treating wounded crew members as they arrived in steady streams, and she had converted the mess hall into emergency surgery space because the medical bay could not handle the casualties, and she operated for hours without rest and saved lives that Kaleth calculated should have been lost. And when he asked how she maintained such focus, she told him that giving up was not an option, because these were her crew and her friends. By the end of the second day, the human fleet was down to 37 operational warships, and the Kryn still had over 120 vessels in fighting condition, and Kaleth's analysis showed the battle would be lost within 6 hours, and he expected Admiral Price to order retreat and save what remained of the fleet, but instead she ordered all ships to press the attack harder. The third day began with a desperate human assault on the Kryn center formation, and every surviving human warship threw itself at the enemy with suicidal determination, and Kaleth watched the destroyer Thunderchild lose all weapons, and then its captain turned the ship toward a Kryn cruiser and rammed it, and the collision destroyed both vessels. The Defiant's main guns were hit by enemy fire, and Lieutenant Porter reported weapons offline, and Sullivan asked Chief Mason how long for repairs, and the engineer said 6 hours minimum, and the commander nodded and told him to prepare the reactor for emergency overload instead, because if they were going down, they would take enemies with them. Kaleth observed the crew accept this decision without protest, and they continued fighting using secondary weapons, and Porter coordinated defensive maneuvers that protected damaged Allied ships, and Sergeant Banks prepared his Marines for boarding actions if any Kryn ships got close enough, and nobody talked about surrender or survival anymore, and they simply fought. The battle reached its critical point when Admiral Price's flagship, the battleship Indomitable, lost main power and began drifting helplessly, and a Kryn dreadnought moved in to destroy the command ship, and Kaleth knew that losing the admiral would break whatever coordination the human fleet still maintained. Then something happened that Kaleth would spend years trying to explain to his superiors, and civilian ships emerged from Sanctuary, and they were transports and mining vessels and private yachts and personal craft, and they were not warships, and most had no weapons at all, and they flew directly toward the Kryn dreadnought. The civilian ships swarmed the massive enemy vessel, and some rammed it, while others positioned themselves to block its weapons, and they died by the dozens, but they kept coming, and Kaleth watched in horror and awe as people with no military training sacrificed themselves to protect the admiral's ship, and the Kryn dreadnought's crew seemed confused by this tactic and hesitated, which gave the Indomitable time to restore emergency power. Admiral Price's voice came over fleet communications, and she was injured but alive, and she thanked the civilians for their courage and ordered all remaining warships to form up for a final assault on the Kryn command cluster. And her words were simple and direct, and she said they had nothing left to lose, so they would make the enemy pay for every meter of space. Every human ship still capable of movement turned toward the Kryn center formation, and they accelerated to maximum speed. And Kaleth realized this was not a tactical maneuver, but a death charge, and the humans were going to ram their entire remaining fleet into the enemy command vessels and take as many Kryn with them as possible. Commander Sullivan addressed his crew over internal communications, and he told them it had been an honor to serve with them and that they had fought well, and he was proud of every single one of them. And then he turned to Kaleth and apologized that the observer would not survive to deliver his report, and Kaleth surprised himself by saying he could not imagine a better way to end his observations. The human fleet crashed into the Kryn formation like a hammer, and ships fired weapons until they failed, and then used their hulls as weapons, and Kaleth felt the Defiant shudder as it collided with a Kryn cruiser, and he saw the view screen fill with fire, and then somehow they were through and still intact, and around them the battle had become pure chaos. The Kryn command structure collapsed under the assault, and their careful formations broke apart, and individual ships tried to retreat while others attempted to maintain position, and the unified Kryn fleet became dozens of separate vessels making independent decisions, and human ships exploited every moment of confusion. Porter screamed coordinates, and Sullivan ordered the damaged ship to pursue a Kryn command vessel, and they fired their last functioning weapons, and the enemy ship's reactor breached and exploded, and the shockwave pushed the Defiant away, and Kaleth checked sensors and saw that the Kryn fleet was retreating and humanity had won. Kaleth spent the days after the battle helping with rescue operations, and he worked alongside Dr. Hayes, searching through destroyed ships for survivors, and he witnessed human rescue teams work for 70 hours without sleep pulling wounded crew members from wreckage, and they never gave up even when scanning showed no life signs, because humans had learned that their species could survive things that sensors said were impossible. The Defiant remained in orbit around Sanctuary, held together by emergency repairs and hope, and Commander Sullivan stayed on the bridge despite his injuries, coordinating salvage operations and medical evacuations, and when Kaleth suggested the commander should seek treatment, Sullivan said his crew came first and he would rest when everyone was accounted for, and Lieutenant Porter had assumed tactical duties, and she ran operations with quiet efficiency, while tears streamed down her face for the friends they had lost. Chief Mason worked miracles, keeping the ship's life support functioning, and he moved through damaged sections with tools and spare parts held together with determination and improvisation, and he told Kaleth that the Defiant had survived because she was a tough old ship, and her crew refused to let her die, and the engineer spoke about the vessel as if it were a living thing that had fought alongside them. Kaleth attended memorial services for the fallen, and there were so many that they held multiple ceremonies over several days, and he watched humans grieve openly for their dead, and Commander Sullivan spoke at each service, sharing stories about crew members he had known and honoring their sacrifice, and the observer began to understand that humans mourned so deeply because they loved so fiercely. During one service, a young lieutenant named Chris Wade, who had been rescued from the damaged engineering section during the first battle, spoke about Sergeant Banks and the Marines who had died saving him, and Wade said he owed them his life and he would spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of their sacrifice. And Kaleth saw that human military culture created bonds stronger than family ties. The colony sent representatives to thank the fleet, and a farmer named Peter Grant spoke for the civilians, and he said his family had watched the battle from the surface, knowing they would die if the fleet failed, and he wanted every surviving crew member to know that 3 million people owed them everything. And his daughter was 8 years old, and she would grow up because humans in orbit had refused to let her die. Kaleth began compiling his report, and he conducted extensive interviews with survivors, trying to capture what he had witnessed in words his superiors would understand. And he spoke with Captain Kate Morrison, who had commanded the strike force that destroyed 6 Kryn capital ships, and she explained that human tactics relied on accepting risk that other species avoided, and that willingness to gamble, everything gave them advantages that could not be calculated. He interviewed the civilian pilots who had flown their ships against the Kryn dreadnought, and a transport captain named Linda Shaw told him she had been hauling grain when the call went out, and she knew her cargo ship had no weapons and no armor. But the admiral's ship was in danger, and Shaw had 2 sons serving in the fleet, and she could not watch their commander die without trying to help, and she survived somehow, and would do it again without hesitation. Kaleth spoke with Dr. Hayes at length about human resilience, and she showed him medical records of crew members who had survived injuries that would have killed any Valorian, and she explained that human evolution on a dangerous world had given them redundant systems and remarkable healing capabilities, and more importantly, humans seemed to survive through sheer willpower when logic said they should die. Lieutenant Porter met with Kaleth to discuss tactical analysis, and she walked him through the battle, explaining human decision-making at each critical point, and she acknowledged that by standard military doctrine, humanity should have lost. But she said humans did not follow standard doctrine. and they created their own rules based on thousands of years of fighting each other, and that experience made them unpredictable and dangerous. Porter explained that the key to human warfare was not technology or numbers but psychology, and humans fought for ideals and for each other, and they would accept casualties that broke other species, and they refused to surrender, even when surrender was logical, and that made them nearly impossible to defeat because the only way to beat humans was to kill every single one, and even then you could not be certain they would not find a way to win. Kaleth asked why humans were willing to die for strangers, and Porter considered the question while looking out at the damaged ships floating in orbit, and she said that humans understood something most species did not, which was that civilization only existed because people were willing to sacrifice for the greater good, and if everyone only cared about personal survival, then society would collapse, and humans had learned this lesson through millennia of conflict. She told him about human military traditions and how soldiers throughout history had held impossible positions and made last stands and sacrificed themselves for their comrades. And these stories were taught to every human child, and they became part of how humans understood themselves and their place in the universe. And when a crisis came, humans drew on these traditions and found the courage to do what needed to be done. Over the following months, Kaleth continued his research and he read human military history extensively and studied their warrior cultures and examined their training methods, and he began to see patterns that explained what he had witnessed. And humans did not separate military doctrine from cultural values, and when they trained soldiers they taught courage and sacrifice and loyalty alongside tactics and weapon systems. He learned that human military academies required officers to study philosophy and ethics and history, and they were expected to understand why they fought, not just how to fight, and this created commanders who led with passion and conviction rather than cold calculation, and their troops followed them because they believed in the cause and trusted their leaders. Kaleth compiled his final report and he struggled to find words that would convey the truth about humanity to his superiors, and he knew many would dismiss his conclusions as emotional contamination from spending too much time with humans but he had witnessed something that changed his understanding of warfare and of civilization itself. In his report he wrote that humanity was not the most advanced species technologically, and they were not the most numerous or the most ancient or the most powerful in any conventional measure, but they were the most dangerous because they had weaponized empathy and they fought not just for survival but for ideals and for each other, and for people they had never met. He explained that humans would accept casualties that would break any other species, and they would hold positions that could not be held and attempt missions that could not succeed and refuse to surrender, even when defeat was certain. And this was not simple bravery but a fundamental aspect of human psychology that made them unpredictable and ultimately unstoppable. Kaleth concluded his report with a warning that would be studied by military academies across the galaxy for generations, and he wrote that the question was not whether humanity would come to dominate the galaxy, but whether the rest of the species would be wise enough to befriend them rather than oppose them, and he urged the Valorian High Council to seek alliance with humanity immediately. He wrote that he had watched humans battle and discovered why even ancient civilizations should fear them, and it was not their technology or their tactics, but their refusal to accept defeat and their willingness to sacrifice everything for something greater than themselves, and that made them the most formidable force the galaxy had ever seen. Years passed and the Valorian Empire became one of humanity's strongest allies, and the Kryn Collective never recovered from their defeat at Sanctuary, and eventually signed a peace treaty, granting humanity extensive territorial concessions, and other species began seeking human alliance and friendship rather than conflict. Kaleth rose to the rank of admiral in the Valorian fleet, and he occasionally met with his human counterparts at diplomatic functions and conferences, and Commander Jake Sullivan had retired and lost an arm in the battle but remained active in human military affairs, and they shared drinks and war stories like old soldiers who had seen too much but survived. At one such gathering, Sullivan asked Kaleth if he had ever figured out what made humans so effective in battle, and the Valorian admiral smiled and quoted something Porter had told him years ago, and he said that humans fought like they had nothing to lose, but they fought because they had everything to protect, and that paradox was their greatest weapon. Sullivan nodded and said that was about right, and he added that humans had been fighting for survival for their entire history, first against their world's predators and then against each other, and then against the galaxy, and they had learned that the only way to protect what they loved was to be willing to die for it, and that lesson was written into their souls. Calith looked out at the stars and thought about how humanity had changed the galaxy forever, and other species now studied human military tactics. But they could never fully replicate them because the tactics were inseparable from human nature, and you could not teach a species to fight. He